You are listening to the serialized audiobook podcast for Blood of the Stars, an epic fantasy novel written by Karyne Norton, read by Paeter Frandsen and Karyne Norton. If you can't wait to listen to the whole audiobook, or if you want a signed physical copy, go to karynnorton.com/shop to get the lowest cost by buying direct. You can also find the audiobook on Audible, Barnes & Noble, and other standard retailers. Please enjoy the next installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton. Chapter 23. Again, Silmar demanded, tapping Eliana's tarot leaf with his staff. She scratched at her back, even though Mavis's message had been healed the night before. She still felt its presence, as if she'd been marked permanently. The entire group had remained somber, except for Silmar, who had gained renewed determination to train Eliana, which was why stopping for water and a rest now meant something different to him. Somatic progenies make up two opposite spokes, constructive and destructive, Eliana said slowly, running a finger over the line on her leaf. Silmar nodded his approval. And what do they do? They adjust the body, their skills ranging from healing and growth on the constructive side of the wheel to sickness and death on the destructive side. She cringed, wondering how progenies on the destructive side justified their work as blessed by the stars. Or sun. Cyrus peered over her shoulder, his red hair falling across her arm. Despite his human blood, Cyrus was an eager pupil, catching on to the rhythm of the wheel much faster than Eliana. And who in our party has that skill? Silmar asked. You and... Eliana glanced around. Lukai. Anyone else? She hesitated, eyeing the group once more. Her gaze lingered on Jasperus. She remembered him creating the masks to hide people from Durakin, along with the storytelling illusions. Hadn't he said that was somatic? Silmar followed her gaze. Good. Jasperus is one. That wasn't really a fair question. We tend to hold our magic close to us. You probably haven't seen enough of it used. Tell me about noetics. She couldn't decide if the idea of holding magic close sounded safer, like they might only use it when absolutely necessary, or if it meant they only used it secretively. Were any of them using their mind-reading skills right now? Cyrus cleared his throat, angling his head toward her drawing. Noetics. She frowned at her wheel. Noetic progenies tune into the mind, feelings, thoughts, memories, again on opposing constructive and destructive spokes. Correct. On the constructive side, they plant feelings, thoughts, and memories, which is what your mother does. On the destructive side, they receive them. It's much harder to see these progenies using their magic, especially in battle. Silmar tapped his temple. But a fight can be won in the mind before it's even begun. Same with the pneumatics, who do what? They sift through the soul, Eliana said, discerning truth in the present and the future on the constructive side, and discerning lies in the present and the past on the destructive side. Which spoke does Eliana fall on? Cyrus asked as Veldin and Iris joined them by the spring's edge. They each found a rock to sit on or lean against. Her mother is a constructive noetic, Silmar said, so perhaps Eliana will lean that way. Emerys is gifted at transferring memories. It's said she can allow someone to relive a moment from her own life with such clarity that they have difficulty grasping whether or not it actually happened to them. She holds back, though, Iris said, her gaze softening. She waters it down because she wants her memories to remain her own as much as possible. Eliana drank in the glimpses she got of her mother, even though they centered around magic. They quenched her thirst far more than the water they'd stopped for, and reminded her why learning the ins and outs of magic was worthwhile. What about her father? Cyrus asked. Or does it pass down from the mother's side? Rildon is a great man, Silmar said, the praise from his lips rare. But he's just a man. As far as we know, he's the first human to use the Star Bridge from Lorvandis. Eliana leaned forward in disbelief. He's Lorvandan? Cyrus frowned. Wouldn't that make Eliana have a low concentration of star blood? It sounded like it should be higher when He broke off, glancing at Eliana, who shook her head slightly. Her trust in these people grew every day, but she still wasn't ready to tell them about Aura. I just thought she'd have more star blood if her magic was so strong, Cyrus finished. Silmar leaned forward, peering at Eliana. I suspect she has more of her mother in her than her father. She even looks more like her mother. He settled back against his large rock. Regardless, her guardians built up her body's demand for energy, which is why we have to wean her. Why don't all half-lights who aren't progenies do the same then? Build up their energy through blood magic? Eliana asked, her hands growing clammy just from voicing the horrid question. Because it's a detestable form of magic, Iris said with a shudder. At first, Eliana shrank back, regretting the question, but she supposed it was the reaction she wanted. If they despised blood magic as much as she did, they would never force her to do it. Do you already feel the energy returning? Silmar asked, studying Eliana. She nodded. The warmth of the sun had overwhelmed her a dozen times already. By the sun's peak, she felt rejuvenated, but the closer they got to the sun's sleep, the more the energy started to feel strained, like her skin wouldn't be able to encase it this same time tomorrow. She knew she could go longer than that. She'd done it in the past, but it wouldn't be pleasant. Good, Silmar said. Even though spokes can be consistent among family members, there are tests done in the schools of nobles to determine a progeny's spoke. We can simulate one of them this evening. See where your strengths lie. Eliana opened her mouth to protest, but Cyrus caught her gaze and raised his eyebrows. This was what she'd come for. She nodded, attempting to align her heart to agree, even though the thought of voluntarily performing magic felt wrong. Silmar stood and brushed off his cloak, calling for everyone to resume their brisk hike. Veldon offered Eliana a hand up, the residue from his webbed fingers feeling more like a lotion than the slime she'd expected. She subconsciously rubbed it in her hands, staring after Silmar. You know, you and I are more alike than you might realize. Veldon's grin widened. My mother crossed the barrier probably a dozen years before your father. I thought Silmar said Rildon was the first, Cyrus said. He was the first Lorvandan. My mother had a different starbridge. Veldon laughed, wiggling his webbed fingers once more before walking backward toward Silmar. Haven't you figured out where I got my webs and water from by now? She was sailing. Half fish? Cyrus scoffed. Saline aren't real. Veldon held out a slimy palm and squirted him with water before turning around. Believe what you want, he called over his shoulder. This first test is almost always right. Silmar's gravelly voice came to Aeliana from the other side of her blindfold. But we'll follow it up with a few others, to be sure. She nodded uncertainly, rubbing her sweaty palms on the trousers she still hadn't gotten used to. They'd stopped trekking through the woods earlier than usual, well before the sun's sleep. Aeliana had been relieved to slide her assigned pack from her back, until Silmar announced that they'd begin training while the others set up camp. There's something before you, he continued. Without touching it, I want you to sense what it is. No matter how concerning it might be, you must leave your blindfold on and try to fix it. He let out a grunt, like he had sat next to her. She imagined his beady eyes studying the object, waiting for her to alter it in whatever way he expected. Fix it? I'm not sure that's the only instruction you'll get. She frowned. I think you've forgotten that I didn't grow up learning the basics of magic. I've done everything I can to avoid it. I don't know how. It's easier if you shut your mouth and make some effort. Was Silmar teasing her? I never shut my mouth. Veldon's reassuring voice came from her left. I still figured it out. The smack of flesh on flesh met her ears, but Veldon only chuckled. She bit her lip, too nervous to laugh along with him. Nothing more than the distant sounds of camp assailed her senses. The rock beneath her backside was cool and a little pointier on the left. She wondered if she'd have a bruise by the time they were done. The starlock warmed against her chest, as if reminding her it was willing to help. Veldon had strung it through a leather cord and fastened it around her neck. She'd been instructed to keep it hidden beneath her tunic, resting against her heart. The points that had dug into her palm now tickled her skin. The others made it sound like it would be a comfort, but it felt more like a reminder of how her blood and this starlock could be a deadly combination. She supposed that was the point. They were training her so the combination wouldn't always be deadly. She took a deep breath and tried again, straining her senses for something, anything. Laughter reached her ears, mingled with the clanking of dishes and the thump of bedrolls being laid out. Kendallen's voice rang out as she teased Lukai, and for once she sounded happy instead of bitter. Water splashed, and Aeliana imagined Jasperus fishing at the creek. He was almost as good as Veldon, when his boisterous laugh didn't scare the fish away. She tried to make out Cyrus's constant chatter, but he was unusually quiet. She frowned, straining her ears. It would be impossible for him to be quiet this long unless someone made him. She turned her attention to Silmar's and Veldon's breathing. Sure enough, there was a third intake of breath coming from somewhere between them. Was Cyrus the object before her? Even if it was him, what would she need to fix? Did he have a loose button? A blister on his heel? She tried to lean into her other senses. Even though he no longer smelled of Della's apple blossoms, she felt certain it was him. Something about the space before her just felt like him. But how did that help her know what to fix? She shifted, trying to hide her agitation, knowing Silmar watched. She blew out a long breath recalling all the times she'd accidentally used magic. When the daisies had grown, when she learned to shoot the bow and arrow. What had she been doing or feeling in those moments? Usually anger or fear, but when Cyrus had taught her to take aim, she'd been calm. She'd held her breath and let her body go still, closing her eyes to tune out the rest of the world. In fact, it was eerily similar to the setup Silmar had created now. Even though the blindfold did its job, she closed her eyes, honing in on the space where she heard extra breaths. Without warning, an image of Silmar filled her vision, as if he walked toward her in the giant taro trees and ferns surrounding camp. She felt herself smile at him, her lips spreading wide, until she saw the staff in Silmar's hand flare to life with its ominous molten glow. Her smile dropped, and the old man growled, pulling her hand down and bending her wrist back. Only it wasn't her hand or wrist. Freckles spattered her skin, and faint scars lined her arm, the result of Silmar and Lukai having healed her, having healed Cyrus. She panicked, recognizing that the memory belonged to Cyrus, but unable to stop it. Silmar seared Cyrus's palm with the heat of his staff. Blood trickled down, and Cyrus screamed. Aeliana stood, screaming with him, and the vision dissipated, leaving her panting. The starlock burned against her chest, making her wonder if it would leave a mark. She reached for the blindfold, but remembered Silmar's warning. If she didn't figure out how to fix Cyrus before taking off the blindfold, would they put him through it all again? How could they have done such a thing in the first place? Anger replaced her panic, feeding the energy that burrowed within her. It wanted a release, and she wanted to let it loose. She wished she could give Silmar the same wounds he'd inflicted on Cyrus, maybe make him regret taking things too far. The intake of breath from her right gave her pause, made her wonder if Silmar could read her thoughts. She knew so little of what his magic could do. She was fairly certain he was a destructive somatic. The killing spoke as she'd come to think of it. But he still had some healing abilities. What else could he do that she didn't know about? Had he already healed Cyrus? Or did he expect her to try doing that now? She sat down, back straight as a rod. Instead of picturing Silmar wounded, she imagined Cyrus's wounds closing up and patching themselves, like holes in a sock, and then smoothing over, like Veldon's seaweed bandages. Her starlock burned hotter, tempting her to rip it from her neck. "What?" Cyrus hissed from in front of her, but he was hushed by Silmar. Still, the little bit she heard from him gave her relief. He was all right. Did that mean she was actually healing him with her thoughts? Hope mixed with dread, leaving her stomach hollow. She didn't want to learn magic, and yet it was the only way forward. It was the right way, but it didn't stop her from breaking into a cold sweat. The balance of right versus wrong left her on edge, but it wasn't just a matter of whether or not she should be doing magic. It was something else. It was almost like patches of hot and cold surrounded her, the cold trying to infiltrate the heat. It didn't belong, and she needed to separate the two. As she did, reality unfolded before her mind's eye. Cyrus sitting across from her, wholly intact, gnawing on his fingernails as he watched her sweat and scream. "None of it's real," she muttered. A stillness settled over her, a rewarding peace, even though she'd been tricked. She whipped off her blindfold, frowning at Silmar as her eyes adjusted to the setting sun and her vision grew spotted. She ripped the cord from her neck, slipping the hot starlock into her pocket instead of letting its confusing burn settle against her skin. Her entire body shook with relief and overexertion, like she'd chased the dragon once more. But then she took in the daisies at her feet, the blood-stained moss, the dark brown splatters on their clothes and skin. Cyrus's pale face. "Sweet stars, what did I do?" she whispered. Chapter 24. "You passed your test," Veldon said, clapping with his overdramatic flair. "But the blood. You didn't hurt me." Cyrus was quick to reassure her. Silmar's mouth was set in a line of grim determination, but his eyes shone with something like curiosity or pride. By now, the others in the group had gathered, probably summoned by her mortifying scream. Their slack faces mirrored the shock Eliana felt as they took in the mess. She reached for Cyrus's bloody hands. "What did you do?" She narrowed her eyes at Silmar. "Nothing." He held up his hands, which were also covered in blood, in surrender. "You're right. It was a mask for the truth, created by Jasperus. Ideally, if you were pneumatic, you would attempt to sift through the truth of it. If you were noetic, you would tune in to our minds or emotions to recognize how they didn't line up with the illusion. If you were somatic, you would adjust his body, attempting to heal him." Eliana turned her glare on Jasperus, whose weathered face held guilt. "If it's not real," she asked, her heart still pounding in her ears, "where did all the blood come from?" "I assume you tried to heal him," Silmar said. "For a new progeny, attempting to heal a wound that doesn't exist usually produces a tingle, or maybe an insatiable itch. In your case," he trailed off, eyeing the splatters. "So I hurt him." The words came out flat. "I'm fine," Cyrus said quickly, placing a hand on Eliana's arm. "You startled me is all. Silmar and Lukai healed me before I could even feel the pain of it." His hand was far steadier than hers, his reassurance sustaining, even as her guilt deepened. She closed her eyes, wishing she could block out the damage she'd done, but the evidence was burned into her vision, present even on the backs of her eyelids. Even when she used magic the right way, she caused harm. "You might have been a wee bit overzealous with your test." Veldon's teasing tone brought her gaze to his. He held up his thumb and forefinger, squinting at the small space between them. "You're like a baby scorpion that uses up all its venom in one sting." Eliana shuddered. This had been a terrible idea. What if she'd killed someone? "Your power was unbridled." Silmar's words came slow. "Dangerous," Kendallin corrected, arms crossed. For once, Eliana agreed with the other woman's negative outlook. She pulled away from Cyrus, afraid that mere proximity could cause him more harm. "It could be," Veldon agreed, "until it's tamed." "So she's a somatic?" Cyrus asked. Veldon nodded, but Silmar held up a hand. "How did you know it wasn't real?" Silmar asked, leaning forward. His arm nearly brushed hers, like he still held no fear after all she'd done.
Did you sift through the lies of the illusion?
I don't know. She threw the blindfold to the ground. The familiar sense of euphoria from the release of energy washed over her, triggering her disgust. She scanned the skies out of habit, but nothing blotted out the orange hues settling into purple dusk. She tried to remember that this hadn't been blood magic. It hadn't been wrong. But this was how it felt when her blood was used. It still felt wrong. She shook her head, attempting to regain focus. I sensed hot and cold, an unevenness that didn't belong, but not until after I tried fixing him. So you first adjusted his body, attempting to heal it? Lukai asked, almost eager. As a constructive somatic, he probably found that idea appealing. Maybe as bondmates, it was desirable to share a spoke. Maybe. Aeliana glanced at Cyrus's blood, unsure if healing was the right word for what she'd done.
Regardless of which she did first, she sifted through lies and adjusted his body. It's evidence she can access both a primary and secondary spoke.
Silmar's beard and mustache split into what might have been a smile.
It's unheard of for that to be present in an initial test.
The others who'd gathered around all hummed their agreements, setting them off into excited chatter that made Aeliana's head ache.
What's a secondary spoke?
Cyrus asked.
Usually, progenies can only access one spoke, and even then, it's the constructive or destructive side that's more dominant, like your hands.
Veldin waved his in the air, involuntarily flicking water.
Every once in a while, a progeny is a bit ambidextrous. That's why Silmar can do some limited healing, even though he's a destructive somatic. He can use more points along his spoke. The most advanced progenies can access a second spoke, always adjacent to their primary.
Veldin and Silmar are the only ones here with secondary spokes, Jasperus added. It's why they can adjust water and metal so easily.
Aeliana eyed the water still dripping off Veldin's hands. I thought it had to do with the
being half sailing? Veldin laughed. No, but I'm guessing there are more salines who wield water than fire.
Silmar shifted, drawing Aeliana's gaze to his staff. That's how you change the shape of your staff.
Silmar and Veldin can probably access more points on the spokes than all the rest of us combined, Lukai admitted. But they can access an element because of the connection between their primary and secondary spokes. Elements connect the spokes like the rim of a wheel.
Or the crust of the piece of pie.
Veldin grinned at her, licking his lips and rubbing his belly. Aeliana pulled her tarot leaf from her pocket, examining the spokes again. So, Silmar is a destructive somatic, and his secondary spoke is
constructive pneumatic,
Silmar said. She traced the two lines out to the rim, then traced the line of the rim that connected them. So anyone with these two spokes would have access to metal? Silmar shrugged.
In theory, magic is like a muscle. It needs to be trained and maintained. It's possible more progenies would be able to access a secondary spoke and rim magic if they trained harder.
A few groans spread through the group, and Jasperus headed back to the cookfire.
What?
Silmar's frown turned fierce as he stared the remaining progenies down.
Velden and I have dedicated our lives to training. It makes sense that we have access to the Rim.
They're also significantly older than most of us, Kendallin said with a smirk.
But Aeliana's not.
Lukai beamed at Aeliana.
And she can already access a second spoke.
Aeliana felt her face heat under his pride, along with something deep in her belly. Kendallin rolled her eyes before joining Jasperus at the fire.
It's true. It usually doesn't present until you've had significant training.
Silmar stroked his beard thoughtfully.
Some access a second spoke decades later. But we'll be able to train you on both, right from the start.
Why didn't they see this as concerning instead of exciting? This was further proof that her magic was flawed. Dangerous. The unease returned with a flutter in Aeliana's stomach. I won't train unless we set some ground rules. She stood, limbs shaking. The coldness in her voice sobered the few who were left. She gestured at the blood splatters. This method was wrong.
It was an illusion,
Silmar said. Until I drew blood. Her voice broke, memories of Arvid and Vera cutting her, overlapping with the memories of Cyrus being injured, first by Vera and again by Silmar. It didn't matter if the memories weren't all real. Maybe that made it worse. It was too much like blood magic, she said. It was too real. Marking him along his scars, making him scream the same way he did that night. If you make me watch those things over and over, I can't. Not after Arvid and Vera. Her voice grew hoarse as so much of her abuse lay exposed before people who, despite being friendly, still felt like strangers in many ways. Lukai inched closer, wrapping his hand around hers. The moment their palms touched, comfort flooded through her, but it felt more like a distraction meant to keep her from addressing the real problem at hand. Iris covered her mouth, blinking furiously, and Velden and Silmar exchanged wary glances.
Are you saying, did you first tune into the memory of the illusion?
Silmar's face paled above his beard, the ridge of his scars going from a deep purple to a spidery pink.
Did you see it that clearly?
Aeliana groaned in frustration. Every word you say still feels like a test. I don't know if I'm sifting through lies or adjusting his body or tuning into memories. I simply know that I saw you hurt him. It was as real as if I'd been there myself. I hated you for it. Hated that you would put him through that just to teach me some sort of lesson. It made you no different than Arvid or Vera. It made me want... She trailed off, her anger fading as she took in Cyrus, whole and unharmed. Humiliation filled the space that had housed the anger.
What did it make you want?
Silmar asked. I wanted to make you suffer in the same way. She shivered, surprised at her own honesty. But if these people thought they could turn her magic into something good, they had to realize what they were up against. Silmar held out his bloody hands, and for the first time, Aeliana noticed fresh pink scars. She bent forward to survey the damage, her stomach curdling with the truth. Not all of the blood had been Cyrus's. Did that mean she'd done blood magic? Was it possible to injure someone with star blood and not do blood magic? She dropped Lukai's hand, wiping her sweaty palms on her trousers.
I thought my cuts were a casualty of proximity, but perhaps your efforts were more focused than I realized, Silmar mused.
He won't use that type of test again, love.
Iris placed a gentle palm on Eliana's arm, her heated gaze resting on Silmar, like a mama bear protecting her cub. No, of course not. Silmar shook his head, instantly contrite. I didn't think. I've never trained someone who'd been. He trailed off, ruffling his thinning hair until it stood up. So she can access all 3 spokes? Holmes' low voice barely reached Eliana's ears. What does that mean? Finally, someone seemed afraid. Someone recognized the gravity of the situation.
It means we have to wean her before we test her.
Velden crouched next to Eliana, placing a hand on her back. His touch was cool, and Eliana sensed energy flooding back through her. But instead of refilling her like the sun replenishing her supply, it soothed what energy remained, bringing its flare down to a tolerable heat.
She's still full of energy, despite having expended more in one night than the average progeny does in a single day. She's accessing all the spokes because her power is out of control.
We can't know which are the false positives, Silmar muttered with a frown. Not until her energy stores are at a normal level, clear of the effects of the blood magic.
Velden's eyes held an apology. We should have guessed it might be that way from the start. It could take a moon or more before she's ready to truly train.
Eliana's gaze volleyed back and forth between the men. She couldn't believe her ears. You still think I should be trained instead of subdued? Either path starts with weaning you off blood magic. We start by teaching you basic alteration, just enough to ease your pain. Silmar stood and headed for the cook fire. Eliana closed her eyes. She should be relieved at their persistence, at their acceptance, but it was hard to feel anything more than fear and exhaustion at the road ahead. Lukai squeezed her arm as he stood, and she opened her eyes to give him a weak smile. Cyrus nodded in sympathy before taking himself to the creek to wash off the blood. Holm guided Iris away, his arm wrapped around her. Only Velden remained.
Give it a moon, and things will have turned around.
Velden picked a handful of daisies at her feet and passed them to her before leaning against a cluster of bamboo. How can you be so sure? She swallowed hard, fighting down the urge to rip apart the daisies he'd given her, the evidence of all she'd done wrong.
Because by then you'll hate Silmar more than you hate yourself. He's a tough trainer.
He grinned, and in spite of everything, her lips tugged upward. If you dislike him so much, why do you follow him?
Velden chuckled. I don't mind the old grump. If he'd trained me, I'd probably hate him. I simply come for the adventure.
He winked at her. They were alone at this point, the others following their stomachs to the scent of cooked meat. Eliana's appetite had gone with the sight of Cyrus's and Silmar's blood. She glanced at the dusky sky, watching for the moon's rise, and with it, the shadows she expected to see.
They won't come,
Velden said, following her gaze. Eliana's face heated, but his candidness emboldened her. Why not?
That wasn't blood magic. Blood magic has far more to do with the intentions behind it than the actual act of spilling blood.
His words should have produced relief, but they were just a reminder of how little Eliana knew.
We don't use blood magic. he added, "and we'll never ask that of you."
Her mind kept replaying the false sight of Cyrus bleeding out, then the real images of the blood covering the two men. She turned away from the blood still staining the moss and rocks.
"Tonight's injuries won't be the last caused by your magic. If anything, that's more reason for you to learn to use it, to control it. I hadn't realized the depth of energy in you until I saw it for myself."
His gaze swept over her, and he shook his head in awe. "I'm not sure I can do this," Eliana whispered, twisting the daisies in her grip. He studied her, his normal laugh lines puckered in thought.
"I once knew a man who took to drinking far too much. At first, he didn't know any different. Had friends who drank just as much, or so it seemed. The more he drank, the more he wanted a drink. Gave him relief, but it was a trick, because the more he drank, the more he became tethered to the bottle and the need to drink more. One day, the man hit his wife, his bondmate. She nearly left him, probably should have, but it scared him as much as her, and he swore to drink less. At first he did, by sheer willpower, but certain friends could convince him to have another one or two. Even having the occasional drink seemed to whet his appetite instead of taking the edge off his cravings. He finally figured out the way to get a hold of his addiction. Know how?
Eliana shook her head.
He gave it up. It was easier for him to swear it off completely than to have even a single drop now and then. His bondmate was more important to him than his drink, and he aimed to prove it.
Velden leaned forward, jabbing a webbed finger in Eliana's direction.
"Sometimes I think you see yourself like that man. By swearing off all magic, you can protect those you care about. It's true. In that regard, you're the same. But you know who I think you're more like?"
Eliana held her breath, afraid of the answer he might give for his own question.
"His wife."
She let out her breath, more confused than relieved. Why his wife?
His wife was a victim of his addiction. Until he found a solution, she took the brunt of his anger and violence. She dealt with the consequences of his actions.
Eliana looked away, blinking back tears.
"When he gave up alcohol," Velden said, "she did too. She didn't need to, but she thought it might help him."
"And did it?"
"It did," he admitted. "But Arvid and Vera aren't here. Using your magic in moderation won't tempt them to use blood magic. In fact, it will make you stronger to resist the temptation if anyone ever tries to use you for blood magic again."
Eliana nodded, giving his words time to sink in. "Thank you, Velden."
He shrugged. "If you want to hear a better story, we need to go get Jasperus."
Eliana smiled.
"You feel lighter than you did before the sun's sleep?"
She nodded. There's always a sense of relief when the energy leaves, whether it's through loss of blood or through...
"Magic?"
He grinned again.
"No way getting around the word. Your guardians drained all your energy, making your body produce more. Tonight, you took a lengthy draft, but tomorrow, we merely skim the cream off the top. If we do that every night, your body will stop producing so much energy. It will recognize that you're storing it, and that it doesn't need to work so hard to take in more from the sun. Your Starlock will help speed up the process."
Eliana's hand automatically reached for the Starlock in her pocket, its sharp edges welcome. "Is your energy source different from other Vendarans?" She couldn't help glancing down at his neck, still absent of a leather cord.
Velden laughed. "Saline are half-lights too, just like Amranans and Devlonians across the other barriers. Saline just happen to occasionally have tails instead of feet. Most of them, anyway.
Eliana gave a faint smile. The legendary water creatures supposedly had bodies covered in scales, their lower halves having fins rather than feet. Knowing she and Cyrus had crossed a barrier, nothing seemed too far-fetched anymore. Besides, how else could she explain Veldon's webbed fingers and liquid secretions? The other night, he'd even shown her his webbed toes.
Many progenies have been brought down by their enemies, Veldon continued, because they wear their starlock on a flimsy cord around their neck.
He pushed off the tree and bent down, angling one of his fishhook earrings for her to see.
I hide mine in plain sight.
She sucked in a breath, eyeing the matching pair. You have two?
He laughed again. No one can have two starlocks, which is why no one suspects that's what this is. Its simple design was easy enough to replicate. Unless you hold them and feel the weight of the true starlock, you'd never know the difference. My mother suggested it.
The urge to hide her own starlock grew strong, but she wasn't sure if it was because she still found the idea of magic so shameful, or if it was because she saw the wisdom in his methods. Where is your mother now? Did she return to Sayla Island in Palin's waters, or is she still in Vendaris? Veldon's jaw tightened, and he turned away.
She's dead. A few years back, a fisherman caught her in his nets, harpooned her like some sort of animal.
Eliana sucked in a breath. I'm so sorry. He nodded, a faint smile crossing his features.
She was different, but there was nothing wrong with her. Just like there's nothing wrong with you.
He gave Eliana a pointed look before pushing off the bamboo to join the others by the fire. I hope you enjoyed listening to this first installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton. To get reminders for new episodes and to stay up to date with my books, be sure to sign up for my newsletter at KarynNorton.com. You'll also get the prequel short story to Blood of the Stars in ebook and audio for free. Thanks so much for listening.